Well, it is so good to be back with you folks and have our second forum with the foundation as part of the SALT seasoning for small churches, where we this week are really looking at the financial health assessment all of you filled out, or many of you filled out. I think there are a few churches we don't have them from, but we will be looking at this financial health assessment, which took responses from you folks along with OGA statistics. Now, General Assembly, as you may have noticed, has changed the format for how they take statistics, and they ask less questions. So our assessment tool is not as useful as it used to be, in the sense that everything right now is 2017 data, which makes it sound like 4 years old. But remember, we don't have 2020 data out yet, right? In 2018 and thereafter, General Assembly began asking fewer questions, which means that we don't have as much information on our congregations as we used to have. And so what I'm hoping you'll do is think about this assessment, knowing it goes back to 2017 data, and think about how has your church changed 3 years since our last report from OGA, but really 4 years since you last submitted data. Have there been many changes? Would this change your traffic light approach that you have on your assessment? And I want you to keep in mind too, how has COVID changed things in this last year? But as we look at this assessment, it's looking at 9 areas of financial health for a church. So we're talking bequests, we're talking participation, planning, leadership, sources of funds, capital campaigns. I haven't named all 9, but that's where it's taking us, right? And are you seeing now this is financial health assessment? I'm working off of 2 screens, so I want to make sure. Good. Thank you, Jim. So here I have the list here now, and I don't have to do off the top of my head. Debts and deficits, bequests and plan giving, leadership, planning, communication, participation, capital campaigns, endowments, and sources of funds. And we're going to look at the results collectively to see, where are we? Were there any surprises when you filled yours out? Now, Gloria, who's joining us from PRC, ran one on Huntington or Old First in Huntington, New York. I've left that one out because for some reason it was different than other ones I've had from Old First Huntington, and it didn't show the data for 2017. And I know Old First actually submitted that, so I'm not sure why it didn't pull it. And then the other church is it King Ferry, who I have them on 2 of the slides, but it appears that between 2013 and 2017, they didn't submit any data to OGA. And so I've taken that out of some of the charts we're going to look at, because we're missing that OGA data. So it doesn't allow us to have a good view. But again, this takes your data that you put into it along with OGA statistics and created this snapshot for you. Did you find it was pretty easy to do this? Did it take you more than 5 or 10 minutes? I'm blowing up my screen so I can see you folks better. Took you less? Took you more? Okay.
It's okay.
Good. Glad to know.
It was easy.
Good. Well, when we look at the list of best practices, and I love this traffic light approach because it makes it easy to really get a quick eye on what's going on. And we see sources of funds. Where do your assets come from? Is it just money in the plate from your members? Do you have rent that you receive for use of your building? Are you dependent upon endowments? And usually a good distribution between the 3 of those is significant. think there are a number of churches, though, that don't have investments that they're drawing income off of. But it's good to look at that. But for what I see, everything showed up green for all of our congregations. But then when we look at the areas where there's need areas to work on, I'm drawn to the fact we had 3 churches who got red lights on bequest and planned giving, which means this is an area they should probably be looking at sooner than later, right? Much sooner than later. And we see overall that 5 congregations really need to be working on planned giving programs. And this is critical for our churches because we know that 29% of all charitable dollars come to religious institutions. And we're not talking seminaries, we're not talking colleges, we're not talking Salvation Army. We're talking churches, synagogues, mosques on the corner. So 29% of charitable dollars go to religion. But when it comes to wills and bequests, I don't know if I've asked you this question last time we were together. What percentage do you think comes to churches? Throw some numbers out at me, or hold your hand up if you think what percent. Good to see you here today, Ed. Maybe you know. Karen saying 5.
Good morning.
Who else? Any other ideas? Karen thinks 5% of wills and bequests come to churches. Anyone else have a guess? I see 2% from Joanne. Anyone else? Jim's saying 4. Okay. Now it's stunning. You folks are even lower than what it is. It's 8%, right? But that begs the question. If Americans give 29% of all their charitable dollars to the church, why is it only 8% of wills and bequests? We're resurrection people. We know we can't take our stuff with us. We know that U-Hauls do not follow hearses. So what's going on? Churches never ask. They just don't think about saying to folks, have you thought about doing something for the sake of the gospel after your lifetime, right? And so this graph here tells me that half of our churches really need to work on planned giving. And that's something you can call me to talk about and work with you. We see endowments, 4 of the 9 churches, actually it's more than half because it's 5 of the 9. 4 of the 9 churches, there's a need, not critical, but there's a need to work on endowments. Capital campaigns, a healthy congregation does a capital campaign every 10 years. Some of our churches don't think about this. Currently my territory for the foundation is PA, New Jersey up to Maine. That's going to shift on July 1. And I'm going to be giving up your synod. But what's stunning as of the over 1,800 churches that I serve currently, it's not uncommon for me to hear a church say, we've never done a capital campaign, or we haven't done one in 30 years. Or maybe we've done a few small ones, to put in a new boiler or a new roof. But really, if your church is doing good long-term planning, we'd say a capital campaign once every 10 years. And then communication, this is the area of greatest need for all of our churches. 7 of 10 churches really could use work on communication in terms of their financial health. And then in terms of planning, we see 4 churches that are in the needs work area, 5 churches in terms of leadership. In terms of participation, the question you're asking here is, what percentage of your congregation contributes to the church? Do you see really either low giving based on your average gift from donors? Or do you have disproportional giving? It's not uncommon, you have a church of 60 members and you have 4 households carrying 40 to 60% of that budget. you know, one person dies, another moves close to their grandchildren, another breaks a hip and ends in the hospital, and then in rehab for uh, 6 weeks. Um, that could really hurt a church and put them in a position that they're not just struggling, but the writing's on the wall. And so it's good to know, where are our contributions coming from? What percentage of our congregation gives something? Are we encouraging our folks to contribute at a personally meaningful level, recognizing that's different for every individual, right? Then we do have two churches that have concerns with debts and deficits. This makes it really hard to be focused on mission and ministry when you're needing to pay back either debt or if you're consistently running deficits, right? But we can see that the remaining 7 churches are doing pretty well. They all got green lights, right? Now, I'm going to ask Karen to break us into groups for 5 minutes. No, we're going to give you 7 minutes. Let's see, we have, how many people in there? 3, 6, 9. Trying not to count myself. So we have 13. So let's do 3 groups of 4. How's that? And I'd love for you to talk with one another. Some of you, I know, Ernie, we don't have an assessment for your church, but I'm wondering how well you know your church serving as interim. Trying to think who else. Who told me they're from Utica? Oh,
That's
Sam,
me.
you're up
I'm
there.
interim
I'm
in
looking down and I'm
Casnovia.
looking up. And you're serving as the interim too. Do we have, I don't know if we have an assessment for your church either.
No.
But as you break into these groups, where do you think your church would fall? And for those who actually did these assessments, what were there any surprises to you? Was this what you expected? Or, sometimes I'll have folks say, we should have gotten a yellow or a red in deficits and it didn't show up. So I'd love for you to talk with one another about what you saw in the responses, or if you have not filled out one of these assessments, where you think your church would fall in these areas. Is that fair? Your reports turned out and your current realities of your church.
I think one of the interesting things was that you look at a broad spectrum of churches, and the smaller churches in upstate New York may look at your interpretation of how life is as being incredibly interesting and perhaps not very accurate.
If this helps too, the data as we look at this, you were compared to the national average, but then compared to 4 other congregations who have plus or minus 5% of your membership within the Synod of the Northeast. So at least your comparable congregations, they may not be on your side of the state, but they are from within your synod, and they are within plus or minus 5% of your church's membership too. Does that change your thought around that issue, David, or what do you think?
When I looked at the narrow set of years of information you were using, it turned out that you thought that we were running substantial deficits. That is not true. If I took 10 years of data, the average net at the end of the year was $1,200 positive. So as far as our budgets went, we were coming in on being on the positive side. We have, in the past 10 years, rehabilitated a structure that had been ignored for a great number of years. And depending on when bills came in, we could have substantial swings either way. But we always carried a positive checkbook.
So
And
remember,
all of our monies go through the checkbook.
yeah, these are statistics that were submitted by your clerk of session to Office of General Assembly. So that's where I'm getting this data that's been pulled into your report, is anything that was reported to OGA. And you can see when we go through this more, that there will be some years that there's information missing. It could be there was a different clerk and numbers sometimes swing, and that anomaly could be just someone different filled it out and interpreted the question differently, or the information wasn't submitted for that area, or just the information submitted, that's what that is there. Anyone else who has surprises like David or concerns? Don, are you trying to talk?
No, I was just laughing. I think some of the churches, before I moved to New York, I served a yoked field in Virginia and rural Virginia. And I think sometimes the churches are nervous about sharing information because they don't want OGA to know too much about, how much money they have in the bank or who's doing what or those kinds of things. Because, well, with reunification, there was a lot of heartache that went out with some of those folks. And so, yeah, I imagine some of that still carries on.
Well, and that was even one of my questions to Karen when you folks were in your breakout rooms. I said, King Ferry, I see, hasn't submitted it information, at least from 2013 to 2017. And is that fear of OGA knowing what's going on in the church? Or is it just not being mindful of submitting that information? It's stunning. If you are a Presbyterian nerd like I am, I guess I don't have it quickly accessible, but I have a number of years of those stats books. But I'm a preacher's kid. And I was saying to Karen, I think even more churches filled those out prior to when we went electronically, because in the olden days, the administrative assistant at the presbytery would call all the churches and make sure the data was in. The presbytery received that information and then submitted it to OGA. And now everything's on the computer. So it's the individuals at the church, usually the clerk of session, the moderator together. And so I think part of where people could also miss filling stuff in for a year or a few years could be they're still thinking to 10, 15, 20 years ago or 40 years ago when the administrative assistant in the presbytery office called and collected that data from them, right?
Right.
So you can have different issues there. Definitely. Anyone else? Jim, does this look like your church?
Well, something you said kind of rang a bell with me, that I would normally think that a capital campaign would be a well thought out appeal that would cover a lot of different categories in the life of a church. But the truth is, in my rural church, the capital campaign is driven by a building issue. We've got to replace the roof. We've got to pave the parking lot. We got to put in new doors.
Oh, we got muted on you, Jim. Keep talking.
That it all hinges on a building issue is my point. Our presbytery does highly encourage churches doing a capital campaign for building purposes to include some other components, namely support for presbytery mission, but it's driven by the building issue. And that sets the timeline. When the roof starts leaking, that's when it's got to be done.
Yeah, and I, serve on the trustees of my home presbytery, Lake Erie, so I get it. No, really for small churches, but it's good for any size church. If you're doing a small campaign, but for a small church, this would be considered significant, say 100,000 or 150,000 or less. You know, ordinarily, if you're doing a big campaign, 500,000 or more, we're going to highly encourage you to get a consultant, because you will raise so much more having that consultant. But for smaller campaigns, it's not cost effective. So we at the foundation actually have hired a consultant, John Ray, who is an elder out of Pittsburgh Presbytery, who's done capital campaigns for over 40 years. And John, and I'm probably getting into too much detail because we'll get into the capital campaign section, but we will pay John to consult just over the telephone, you know, 2 or 3 calls typically with a committee, or, you know, small church could be the whole session of 4 members, right? On how to raise funds. And typically, you know, if you have to get a boiler, or it's funny, I did a program for the national church, and all these people down south didn't know what a boiler was, and that just boggled my mind. I know my people in the Northeast, and I know my churches who've boilers are always our issue, right? Where it's cold, you need boilers. But if it's the boiler or the roof, I'd also say, you know, call me first. We have some good resources to think about. What do you need to do and why, and how do you tell the story well so people see how it benefits mission and ministry? Adding in that mission component, you know, that 10% off the top is going to go out in mission. And this isn't a tax on this special gift, but this is a value that we have, that whenever we do something for ourselves, we also engage in mission. So don't let people see it as a mission tax. But I would say, if you're ever looking to do a campaign, if it's for that project, I'd also encourage you to think about what other projects might you need to do in the next 10 years, because you don't want to ask constantly. And so think about what else might get rolled into that $60,000 boiler. Are there windows you need to replace? Are there some other projects that really need to be done? Something with sound equipment, you know, what might it be? And so how do you think about that? But that's where you can call your ministry relations officer, help you think through those early stages, but also get a referral to John Ray. It's the MRO who'll give that referral. I just called John 2 days ago about a church in Pittsburgh Presbytery and said, hey, can you give them a ring? But if you're looking to do a larger campaign, again, give me a ring, or my new colleague that comes in July 1, and we're here to be of help too. Anything else that you saw interesting, Jim, as you looked at your report and as you listened to folks in your small group?
No, we didn't have a lot of time, so we were only talking about capital campaigns. And I know that in our presbytery, if you reach a certain dollar threshold, which is a percentage of something, then you have to consult with presbytery trustees. So they're a key player in this kind of stuff. And that's really handy, because with some, like rebuilding a roof, we're not going to have all the money in hand when we want to do the project. So we need to have in place a provision for borrowing money from presbytery. So connecting with trustees early on is very important. And I forget the formula, but I think for us, it was something over $20,000 was where we had to consult with trustees. And it turned out we got permission for a bridge loan, but we didn't end up using it. Turned out the project was slightly delayed, and enough money came in that it all worked out.
Very good. And like Gary Presbytery, you know, it's really any size loan, you have to get approval by Book of Order standard. Any loan that you take out, you need to get trustees approval at the presbytery level. But, you know, our presbytery also gives out loans, provides loans, low interest loans. But there are a number of presbyteries that don't. So as we continue our conversation today, I'm when we get into the capital campaign more detail, I'll be interested to see. Other folks, any surprises when you look at the overall assessment?
Just one more thing,
Yes.
Ellie. We borrowed from ourselves on one of our projects, which seemed like an easier way to proceed. And then we paid ourselves back. So we took money out of one pot and then repaid it.
It's good to hear you repaid yourself. What we see at the foundation, we usually don't recommend you borrow from yourself because there are a lot of churches who don't repay themselves, and then they deplete their quasi endowments or investments, you know. And so when you borrow from another, then you have to repay. But I'm really glad to hear that you did that successfully. So it sounds like you had really a strong commitment from your session, and if you had a separate board of trustees, so that's great to hear. Others on looking at the overall assessment, any other commentary from the groups? Yes, Joanne.
Yeah, well, when I received the results back and I looked at some of the things that they said we needed to follow up with leadership and stewardship and endowments and major givers, I found that really didn't truly reflect the generosity of the people in the congregation. Of about how much they give, and even as far as capital gains are concerned, much like Jim, when we need something to be repaired, everybody steps up and offers to defray the cost, and it really helps tremendously. This year we needed a new roof. We've had leaks. We need the interior fixed. We have a mold issue, and we are upgrading our whole sound system. But everybody's rolling up their sleeves and they're pitching in. But that when I stop and I think about it, that generous spirit is also taking and bringing it into the ministry in the community where people need help, and we adopt families for this reason and what other reasons. And so I would say that when I look at this, it doesn't really reflect the ministry and the work of the church.
Often I'll hear that if we have something we need, whether it's fixing this or that at the church, or there's a mission opportunity and it's named. Many of our churches, it's easy to rally the resources to fund those things. I'm wondering, does your church experience that same generosity with the general budget, paying the electric bill and buying Christian education materials as for just general, or is it more that those extra engagements are what drive people and excite them more?
We pay our bills and we really don't discuss it. I would say, being a small congregation, we don't put that much into music and education because we have only a few children. But I think if the need arose, we would rise to the occasion. I have to admit, I've only been with the church a year and a half, but I'm pleasantly surprised at their generosity.
Very good, very good. I've worked with some small churches personally in ministry, but I really reflect on the small church that my grandmother was a member of for over 70 years. She belonged to a church in Rome, Ohio, which was very small, and then later in Orwell. So actually, she was probably an 80-year member of Orwell when she died at 96. And maybe a 75-year member when she died at 96. But what was stunning is this is a church, I'll confess to you, my dad met my mom there and married her back in 67. you're not supposed to do that. But so it was my dad's first call, right? And they've had full-time and part-time pastors on and off 69 when he left. But what is stunning is that church has been struggling the last 5 years or so. Mother died a year and a half ago. I think 2.5 years ago, she got a call, even though she doesn't live in the community. She had to move in with my uncle about 5 years previously, but my grandmother was one who tithed. And when she moved away, half of her tithe went to Orwell North Church and half went to First Hopkinsville. And members called her, pleading with her to increase their giving because the church was experiencing shortfalls. My grandmother wanted to say, well, have you asked others if they'll start tithing? Because I do tithe, and half of it comes to Orwell and half goes to First Pres Hopkinsville. So I think, sometimes some of our churches experience just consistent good generosity, but some of our churches live in scarcity too. And it's a recurring theme of scarcity. And I think there can be growing edges for members. My grandmother was not all that, but she was committed to tithing, right? And there are probably some growing edges that others could have been giving at a personally meaningful level, even if it wasn't tithing. That might have helped meet some of the gaps that congregation's experiencing. Now they have a part-time Baptist serving the church. I'm not so sure how that came to be. And they're making it through. But the last full-time pastor they had was 2 years ago. And so our congregations experience different things going through time too. Let's go ahead and jump to this next slide. Let me get my screen sharing back up for you. Can you see that? Let's make sure. I'm going to expand you folks so I can still look at your faces while I'm screen sharing. There we go. When we do look at average per giving per unit, you can see that the national average, gotta get my cursor over here, really about $1,500 a year. And know that the Presbyterian Church USA, that is per giving unit. If we look at per worshiper, we would say the average is $2,200. Why? Because it's usually people in worship who contribute more than people who don't worship consistently, right? So we would see average per giving per worshiper about $2,200, but you see here that it's right around the $1,500 mark. But what's interesting, and it has dropped, it's closer to 1,080 right now. But what's interesting is that we're actually on the low end of Presbyterians. If you look at other flavors of Presbyterians, they're much more generous than we are. But we also see the group average. So the group average, I'd say that's probably about $1,200 through this period. We had a big jump with First Pres Livonia. That put a big number there, as well as Columbiana and Lafayette. So that brought that average of the group up significantly too. Also a big jump here for Byron. So I don't know what was going on in 2017 at Byron, Livonia, and Columbian and Lafayette, but we saw some big jumps there, or even here in 2014 with New Hope. So we see some different numbers, and part of that could be that a lot of people's year-end giving actually showed up in January of the following year, so maybe that's why we have a big jump here. We'd have to go back and talk to our treasurers to know more, but we do see some of our churches, Ben, I'm wondering, we see Scipio dropped. I'm guessing that was when there was an interim, maybe. Would that be right, Ben?
I don't, well, I think part of it is they were terrible at reporting information. So I think to some degree I think there was a period where there wasn't, there was a transition in treasurer and also in stated clerk. So I think some of the data being reported was probably not complete. They also did have interims. I'm the first called pastor they've had in, I think, a decade. So,
Huge.
so I think, yeah, I think definitely it was a combination of transitions and the data reporting process. And I think in 2017 was when they began having conversations about wanting a pastor. So I'm wondering if that affected the giving.
That's interesting. And
Yeah,
then
generally
so here
speaking,
you're
they're-
above the national average then because of
Right.
the conversations and really an extra commitment to make that happen, huh?
Yeah, because generally their giving is consistent. Even during COVID, it's consistent. So those little tiny ones, I think there's some anomaly there.
Yeah. And then if your church, you don't see, you see, like here, we don't have, I'm picking this one because I can eyeball it real quick. Byron, we don't have any data in 15. And there was a number of different areas you'll see where just the data wasn't submitted. And so that's why we don't have that, right? So it's different for each of our churches. And again, often it just depends on who's doing that work at a particular time.
It was probably when we changed clerks who were less familiar with the annual form to fill out.
Absolutely. And then timing of when is it due in as well, right? Was it submitted in time for when DA starts running their numbers? When we look at websites and electronic giving, of the 9 churches that completed assessments, I thought it was very interesting. The majority, so 5 of the 4 have a website. Of the 4 who did not, 3 have a presence on Facebook. How about Sam? Was it your church and Ernie's church that did not have fill out the assessment? Is that right?
Right, Casanova, I didn't fill out. I guess I wasn't in the loop on that.
Sorry, no worries. Sorry. So tell me, do you folks have a website? Do you have Facebook?
We
Yes.
have Facebook, and there is a website, but I got to find out whether it's still active and who maintains it, because it needs to be updated from the previous pastor.
Indeed. When new people want to come visit your church, even if you only get a few people here or there, first thing they're going to look is online. Do you have a
Right.
website or a Facebook page? And if the information outdated, if it's really outdated, they might go to the Methodist church or the Lutheran church down the road. Sam, you were starting to say, so you have website and Facebook too?
We have a website that's kept up to date. We put our worship up on YouTube. That's connected to the website. We really don't do much with Facebook.
Very good. No problem. But you've got that.
Sorry.
website.
Yes, we do. I don't do much with Facebook. Let's put it that way. It's not my thing.
That's okay. And tell me, Sam, at your church, do you have online giving? Are people able to make gifts online?
Yes, we do have online giving.
Okay. And how about you, Ernie?
No.
No. Okay. Very good. So again, websites and Facebook are so important. Having some kind of web presence so that people can know where you are, when you worship. What do I need to do when I arrive for worship or Christian education, spiritual formation, whether it's for kiddos or middle-aged or older adults? What's expected of me? Really keeping in mind those folks who might just be exploring, but they don't know your church. And you might think, we're in a small town, everyone knows us. But someone moves in, or someone is feeling that they're not being fed where they currently are. Your church may be their next spiritual home. So putting that information there, and also making sure that the address, the physical location is clear. So many churches don't put that in their contact information at the bottom of the webpage. So that's helpful too. In terms of electronic giving options, of the 9 churches that filled out, 4 churches had no electronic giving options. Where that concerns me, particularly in the last year when we've been in pandemic and worshiping not in person, you're likely back in person to some extent now, but there are still people who aren't going to be ready to worship with you yet, right? And if you, historically, I would say if you only take cash or check in the offering plate, or nowadays with the pandemic in the box, you're limiting full participation in worship. Offering is part of the liturgy. It's part of the work of the people. And if you say, we only take cash or check and you have to mail it in or drop it in the plate or box, you're saying, well, not everyone's welcome to participate in all of worship. And so I have plenty of churches who say, well, no one's going to ever use it. And I say, be ready for your kids and grandkids who don't carry cash. Many of them don't even have $5 in their pocket. But what's interesting is we've looked at just Vanco studies in the last year. We used to say the average gift in terms of all online giving is $63. Just in the last year, through the churches using the Presbyterian Foundation, the average gift has been $138, which really beats the $5 in someone's pocket, right? Now, you might have $5 gifts online, but you also might get $250 gifts online. And now that we're worshiping and offering worship even hybridized, or maybe some of the churches are still fully online, making it easy to give is so important. And that's from, telling people cash or check, you can drop it off at the church, you can mail it to the church, right? Another option is online bill pay. If you're already paying your bills online, simply set the church up as a payee. It's free. And the bank will send us a paper check. And, you can do a recurring gift that way. Through electronic fund transfer, making the gift directly being transferred electronically from your checking or savings account, credit or debit cards. And some churches will say, oh, we don't want to do that. We don't want people taking out debt. That's where we educate. But a lot of church folks really want their John Deere points, their Ford points, or their REI points, right? There are different things. So they want that ability. Another way is through qualified charitable distributions. Sean, I think it was your church. Could it have been your church that I saw you talk about DAF gifts? Was it a different church? Or was it New Hope? Or was it New Hope's church that had that listed? Who's from New Hope? Who's from New Hope? Anyone?
That would be Lori or David.
What was the question, Ellie? I'm sorry.
One of the websites had DAF gifts. Make a gift online by clicking here for PayPal, or give through your donor advised fund.
No, that's not New Hope.
Someone I was reading, I was looking at websites today.
So just along those lines, Ellie, I'm channeling Lori, who wrote a question in the because her mic's not working. They do Facebook. She wanted to know that, she says, we need to add online giving, but cost in the past has kept us away. Can we use online giving offered by the Presbyterian Foundation? Can that be used on Facebook? Is it Facebook compatible?
Yes, and it's much better than using Facebook service. Facebook service does not give you donor information, and it takes a long time for the money to actually come to the church. Through the foundation, we offer service. We've been offering online giving to churches since July of 2013. We started our beta site, and in 2017, we moved platforms. We use Vanco, V-A-N-C-O, Payment Solutions. They're the leader on church online giving, but it's less expensive to come to us than to go to Vanco directly. And so there's no startup fee, there's no recurring fee. It's just a 2% transaction charge, whether you give your checking or savings account, Visa, MasterCard, Discover, or Amex. So there's no additional fee for the credit cards above that 2%. But if you don't have a website, you can still use it with Facebook. You can, you'll get a link for a donation page. And I'd recommend, one, anytime you have an e-newsletter or email go out, have at the bottom of the page to contribute or donate to such and such church. Click here. It is a long email address. And so I tell folks, just drop that into tiny URL or bit.ly, and you can customize it by putting in, FBC, or we'll say New Hope Presbyterian Church, right? And so it'll be tiny URL / New Hope Presbyterian Church. And then you can use that in any of your electronic pieces. You can add that pin it as a post at the top of Facebook. And if you don't know how to pin a post so it's always at the top on your Facebook page, just Google it and Google will tell you how to do it. And you can add it to the About section, but I really recommend pinning it to the top of your post so it's always there in the front where people can see it. You also get a QR code, which is one of those black and white squares that people can scan their phone. Now, I've had a few churches post these on their websites. Don't put that there. Put your link there. So it's taking one step away. But QR code, really handy for any printed pieces you have, as well as if you're doing a slide deck during worship, put your QR code on the slide deck for those worshiping online so they can scan that QR code with a separate device. That way, if you put the donate button on the slide deck during worship, they'll click away from worship, but we don't want them clicking away from worship. We want them to stay in worship. But that QR code can be really handy on a slide during the time of offering, that people can take a second device, an extra tablet or their cell phone and scan it. So it is possible. And it's really easy. It's a 2-page application. And you send a picture of a voided check for the church checking account. And if you'd like more details, just give me a call. I'm happy to do a little Zoom or WebEx meeting with your session or your committee, answering their questions and walking them through and even showing them what it looks like on the donor side. And then another benefit is because we're a proper foundation, we receive and receipt that gift on behalf of the church. And this is where church treasurers really like it, because they're not having to record the donor gifts. Sure, they can run the reports and look at who's giving, but because we're already sending the receipts, they're just eyeballing it. They're not putting it in the system. They just show the total amount that came over each month from the foundation as income from the foundation. And I can talk more about that too. But having these different giving options is so important. And also knowing that any of your members who are 70 and a half or older, who have a traditional IRA, they can give out of their traditional IRA, and it counts as a qualified charitable distribution. So it counts toward your RMD, but it goes to the church tax-free, which is better than a charitable deduction. It means your adjusted gross income is lower. That means you may even be in a lower tax bracket because of the contributions you give, right? And so if you already know, say you're the average Presbyterian given $1,500 and you're over 70 and a half or older, you can give out of your traditional IRA. And it really is the benefit to you. So letting your folks know that. And I can send you I'll send Karen a couple bulletin inserts, but I'd recommend putting them in your bulletin or putting it up as a slide if you're doing hybrid worship once a quarter, just to let people know. And then the last way to give is with planned gifts, naming the church in your will or as a beneficiary of life insurance or as your beneficiary to your retirement accounts can be real significant too. So definitely I encourage churches who aren't doing electronic giving to do so. And then I'm curious, for those of you doing it, are you seeing much come in? I mean, I get reports on people using our service, and I see we have some churches who have 10 to 20,000 coming in a month. Those are bigger churches, but I see churches who have only $30 coming in a month, which, you know, that's $30 they might not have had. But this last week, I went and looked at a church who I knew signed up with us 18 months ago. And I've just started getting the results of collectively what each church gets. And I thought, this church is only getting $30 a month. What is going on? So I went to their website, and I tell everyone, put it at the top of your website, give now or donate, right? This church had it 2/3 of the way down, so no one could find it. And then on their index of things you could click on, they had automatic giving. And I said, well, I recommend changing that to donate or give now. But it said, coming soon, online giving. They've had online giving for 18 months. So there are people that don't know it's there. So part of it is reminding folks, here's a tool. If this is a useful way for you to give, great. If you're someone who wants to write a check, great. Figure out what's the best way for you. But if you're not experiencing a good response to your online giving, give me a ring, and I can be happy to look at your website and see if there's anything I pick up as an outsider that might be helpful to make it easy and accessible. There are plenty of churches who do not put that donate or give now button at the top of their website because they feel like it means they're asking for money. Remember that those who use the web are conditioned to look for it at the top. So you're not being greedy by putting it up there. You're just living into what they're conditioned to look for and find that easily at the top of their page. Some church giving statistics. This is 2018 Bank studies. 62% of the congregations desire to give electronically. That has jumped significantly since COVID. 58% attend services at least once per week. Actually, in the Peace USA, we've seen that drop to 40. Well, we've seen attendance, monthly attendance, to be 40% attend at least once a month. 34% made weekly contributions. And when we look at the 2019 study of church or congregational economic practices, this was done by the Lake Institute. They've been doing these kind of studies for over 50 years, but they did this big study in 2019 and learned that of all different denominations and faith traditions, that 78% of contributions were received in the offering plate during worship. And so this was really significant for our churches when we moved into COVID, right? I'm going to just jump ahead on some of these other giving statistics, but if you'd like to know more, come talk to me. And a lot of people will say, well, older people don't use this stuff. 54%, this is 6 years ago, 54% of donors were giving online who are 60 and older. When we look at your churches and the percentage of budget to mission, we see some differences. National average, it's really 11 to 13% given on between these 5 years. But we do see variables, and this is an area that a lot of churches didn't report on. You know, they might report on total giving, they might report on deaths and bequests, but they did not report on this section. This is one of the areas people will leave out. And so, unless they're just not giving to mission, but my greater suspicion was they were just leaving it out. What do you folks think? What we do know is that churches who have a strong commitment to mission, in particular when session includes that as part of their budget, we have often a lot of pass-through that we'll do as a congregation, but when session includes that as part of their budget, and maybe it's a growing edge, maybe it's we're moving from 1 to 2% goes out in mission of what we do as a church, of our total operating budget. You know, maybe in the next 5 years, we get up to that 5% mark. But the more we give away in mission, the more generous our members are. And so that can be really significant to our churches. Any comments? You want to unmute yourself and talk to me? Lori Shipman, we haven't heard from you. I think the Loris were really quiet this time and last time. I'd love to hear from the Loris. And I can't hear Karen either. I'm not hearing anyone.
Good grief. Sorry about that. So Lori's mic is not working.
Oh,
so
that's right.
Someone was chatting, Lori Shipman. So, but she answered your question before you even asked her to answer the question. So she writes, so much of our mission is done through donated gifts, and it was not recorded as a dollar amount.
Okay. So how do we think of putting that into our story so people can understand this is part of our witness and our being too, right? Can we include some in our budget so we get some mark there that we can talk about how session is being intentional about this, but also celebrating all those additional mission gifts that may come as pass through, where our folks are truly being generous. Yes, Jim.
Our church for a number of years used a narrative budget that on the page dedicated to mission, we could also list all of the in-kind contributions and all the special appeals that don't get into the annual budget. And that was a good visible way to show us that we are a lot more generous than our budget actually shows. But what that doesn't help is someone like you crunching the numbers, because you don't see those pieces. You just see the ones that checks have been written from the church for.
Mm-hmm.
So that's and I would much prefer that stuff to be run through the general budget so we can see it, but I'm up against the way things have always been done.
Yeah.
So the last church I served was a small urban church, and we had a bunch of folks who gave all sorts of gifts that were not financial for mission. And so what we did in November around Thanksgiving is we had a Giving Sunday, sort of corresponded with stewardship, but brought up this huge basket that had in it representations of the kinds of gifts that had been given. So there was a prayer shawl that somebody had knit representing the 60 that had been knit that year. And there was, some cans of food that went to the food basket. And we recognized those ritually during worship and gave thanks to God for all the gifts that had been given. And then tied that in with a newsletter article the Sunday after, which basically said, these were the gifts that were represented. Are there other gifts that we missed? Please make sure that we know so that we can include them here, just as a way of, that whole culture of generosity.
Absolutely. Yes, Jim.
We don't tend to put denominational offerings in that mission giving category. We treat them as pass-through items. So what you see on the bar graph does not include 1 great hour of sharing, Pentecost offering, or joy offering. I think they should be in there. What do you think, Ellie?
Yes, they can be in there, but I would say, here we see a national average of 11 to 12%. And I would say still work on growing your mission in your regular budget, because we really truthfully know that the more a church, I can give you an example. This is a church that left our denomination, Highland Park in Texas. They had a 1-for-1 match. They needed to buy a new chair for the church, and it was $50 for the fellowship hall. They had to raise an additional $50 that went out in mission. That church never had problems with stewardship, right? We might not be doing that 1-for-1 match, but if we can grow what we're doing and be able to articulate that and say that we as a session are really intentional about this, that this is something we value, those churches who do that have less problems with scarcity, for sure.
I'm looking at my numbers and I'm wondering, I had asked my session members to take the assessment too, after we had our meeting and at our last session meeting. And I think some of them did. And my curiosity is, do they just not realize how much money we give away as a church?
So again, this is coming from your actual GA statistics. So it's coming down to how it was reported to GA.
Okay, well, then that's my
Which-
guess, is that we're just not reporting properly.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I know that it's above 10%.
Okay.
I know that for a fact because that was something I pushed for
Yeah.
when I first started here, and the church was actually, they had taken loan from the synod, and that was one of the requirements from the synod. And once we paid off that loan, I just never told them, so we just kept doing it. So every year we have what do they call it? The mission, cooperative mission, or cooperative giving, or something like that. There's something that the synod asked them to do, and so every year we still do it, and it's usually to some organization that someone has a hankering for, like the Samaritan Center or the Vera House or whatever it happens to be at the time. But yeah.
And keeping that in mind, that's where you can draw stories from, have the synod tell you, where are these going? And do you have some stories on here that I can drop in a newsletter so people can see how their contributions are making a difference, right?
Absolutely.
So keeping that in mind. I haven't heard from Doug Hatch at all, or we haven't heard from Doug Hatch. And we still haven't heard from Lori Anson or Lori Cooney too. So do you have anything to share?
In the time that I've been at Marathon, we've always reached more than 10%, and we're averaging 13 to 15% for missions, and we kind of count everything. Recently, we decided that all those cans that went to the food pantry, that we would give credit for 50 cents for each one of those cans, even though they were 75, 78 cents, $1, $1.25. We wanted something to get credit for those so that we could put that in. And that's probably why our mission giving is so high. We also designate certain areas of specific church related, the Council of Churches locally, heifer projects, Doctors Without Borders, some of those national programs. And even though it's a congregation of 31 members, but now only 12 to 15 on a Sunday, the one great hour of sharing, we had 320 some dollars in loose change.
That's great.
So it took the treasurer 2 or 3 weeks to count it. I mean, because she wanted to roll it up. She didn't want to take it to the bank and have them count it because there's a fee involved, or somewhere there's fees involved. So we feel comfortable, but the unfortunate thing in dealing with my session, they don't want to see the church run as a business. It's a family. And if the family needs to repair something in the house, the family gets together and takes care of it. It's not, well, we got to do it with some sort of a special, send out a newsletter and advertise to everybody so that they get a physical presence and then they can respond to it. It's just people understand that what needs to be done gets done. And as I mentioned in the small group, we don't have a stewardship campaign because my session said, when I started in 2009, I said, the reason that we don't is that somehow people feel guilty if their financial situation changes and they haven't met their obligation. So we just don't have a stewardship campaign because it gets covered. So,
well, and if you have a lot of farmers in your community, if you might be like that, I live on a farm, so we don't do it professionally. No,
it's a small community. Some are professionals, but as I say, it's run as a family. It's a congregation of fellowship, and we don't put any emphasis on resources. We've had a painting project that got repaid. We've had a siding project, and it was not, we didn't name it a capital campaign. We just said, here's a fund for putting on siding. And now we may have to have another project to replace some shingles on a steeple. but these are not major projects. When you talk about $1,000 to $2,000, it's not a major capital campaign.
But
People
it sounds
just-
like you're making sure you're not leaving deferred maintenance for
No,
another day. And there are plenty of churches who it's kind of like, who was the old car place? If you need to get your car painted, they'd say, you can pay us this much now or it'll cost you more later.
yeah, but
What-
those are in the details when you
Yeah.
get your car painted.
Yeah, but it always costs more later to take care of things, but there are plenty of churches who put off maintenance issues and have lots of deferred maintenance. And it sounds like it's not the case, perhaps with your congregation, and that's a great thing.
One of the advantages is that the heating is electric. And we don't have to worry about being supplied with propane or a boiler. And if the electric goes out, the whole village electric goes out.
Yeah. And we're seeing churches, there are a lot of churches I know in West Virginia. I haven't heard in New York as much, doing even solar to be good stewards environmentally, but finding that that's beneficial if they have a primarily electric building too.
Yeah.
So that can be significant. Thank you for sharing that. And Doug, we didn't have a assessment for your church. So tell me too, do you have a web page or Facebook? And do you offer
Negative.
online giving?
Negative on both.
Okay.
Small community, it's word of mouth. There's a newspaper that gets delivered, and I advertise in the newspaper as to what is going on Sunday, and that's probably the only communication most members get, other than the newsletter once a month.
Yeah. You may want to consider it, particularly for younger generations, and because younger people, that is a primary mode of communication, and that could be really helpful. I'm trying to think, was it one Lori Anson or Lori Cooney, one of your churches? I think maybe I didn't get a assessment for. I'm trying to think who it was.
No, you didn't get one for New Hope, and I'm not quite sure why, but
Oh no, we did get one for New Hope and Parish.
oh no, but not the percent of budget to mission.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So,
2-minute warning, Ellie.
Thank
Sorry.
you.
yeah. So
Okay. It might have been Lori Anson. Remind me what church you're at, Lori. Are you at the Tri?
Otisco.
Oh, you're at Otisco. Oh, so we got yours.
Yeah.
Who was at? There was like not a Tri-Covenant. It's Wells Delphi. Who's in the Covenant churches?
Yeah, that would have been Susquehanna Valley then. I'm not sure
Susquehanna
who.
Valley.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So we didn't get a report from them. Okay. We look at a number of church deaths across our churches. National standard, 5.5 deaths. You can't have a half death, but we're looking at average, right? But we can see it's up and down for some of our churches, and this plays in to a lot of issues. Do we have new members joining as quickly as we're burying people? When I served a church in Warren, PA, we were a moderate, medium-sized church, but I buried 40 people in 3.5 years. And 25% of our congregation was 85 to 101. That church dropped from 113 in worship every week to now they have fewer than 60 in worship, and that was even pre-COVID. Just our churches are changing dramatically because of actuarial tables. Human beings only live so long, right? But as we think about that, we also see bequests. You can see the average, national average is a little over $13,000. But many of our churches haven't gotten bequests. It's interesting. Is this Columbiana? Sean? You must be talking about Legacy Sunday, are you?
Yes, yeah. I usually talk about at least once a year, and then there's someone from our acting treasurer. He's actually does it too. We talk about gifts and giving, and it grows back to that when I was in seminary, there was a big push. They had, I don't know who it came from exactly, but there was always forms about gifts and giving at the time of death. There was also the opportunity for a do not resuscitate form that was part of that, and there was all kinds of things that came, and it was a little package, and you could share that. And yeah, I mean, the churches I served in Virginia were extremely well endowed, and that probably is why they didn't tell the presbytery how much money they had every year. So that was one of those things. But yeah, they this congregation was just very open to it, and we've been we've been unfortunate in the number of deaths that we've had. I've been here for 10 years, and I've done over 100 funerals. And then yeah, in the midst of that, there's always there's been at least one, usually two or three folks over the course of the time who have set it up where the church would receive that monies.
Well,
I think her computer died.
yeah, I think so.
Well,
Ellie,
because I plugged in. I apologize. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I just looked to make sure mine was plugged in because I thought maybe it was me.
No, because I plugged in. I apologize.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that, though, Sean. That's fabulous. And so that just comes down to simply talking about it, letting folks know it's an option, and know that you're not doing this alone. We created the stewardshipnavigator.com, which is a free resource for all congregations, really with churches of 100, 125 members or less in mind. And it has great resources for stewardship. Even Doug, if you're not doing a stewardship ask with pledging, there's still great resources to think about. How do we tell our story well? And there are benefits to being a small church. I do a little workshop on asset-based stewardship for small churches that can be really useful. And there are great benefits to being a small church, but there are also some things sometimes we don't think about, and we think everyone knows, and they don't know. So we just have to be mindful. And so there are great resources just to think about what are things to help us lift up our story well. And then there is a planned giving module in there that has step-by-step resources. And then what I love is there's a little web page generator. So if your church already has a website, you can drop in your logo. That might just be what you have on letterhead. It might just be the PCUSA cross and your church name, right? But you drop that in as your logo, add your contact information, and it will generate a website that you just grab that hyperlink and add it to your web page, your website under the giving tab, where people can give now, where they can learn about maybe making a pledge if your church does that, or some churches don't like to call it. I like to call it an estimate of giving. Doug, that takes care of some of the fears for that are experienced in your church. It's an estimate of giving. We know life can change. But I love it because it pre-populates all the information. So most churches would never have the energy to put together a planned giving webpage, and you have everything you need there, and it just generates it for you. And then you just add that hyperlink to your website, which is a really nice feature. So if you haven't gone to www.stewardshipnavigator.com yet, I'd highly commend it to you. And it'll give you a step-by-step approach on how to put together a good planned giving program too. And then my last slide was just percent of budget from investment income. So there's an anomaly there with Scipio, so I don't know what that means. What we do know is if you are have more than 18% of your church budget comes from your investment income, what we know is that giving drops because people think the church doesn't need it. It's great to have investments if you have them that can really stimulate mission, ministry, and help with building and grounds. But being wise stewards of those and always encouraging folks to give. so that they know there's an opportunity that can make a difference in your mission and ministry. So, you know, other than that real anomaly with Scipio, I would talk about, you know, I see Livonia showing that in 2016, a little over 20% came from investments. So I'd look at that number and wonder, was that really the case? Particularly when it's much lower the next year. So just makes you wonder aloud about those numbers. But if you really consistently year over year saw that, you know, 20, 25, 30% of our income to maintain our ministry comes from investments, that's when I would encourage churches to give more away in mission, which then encourages your members that their dollars make a difference and are helpful too. But we don't see that here. And there are a number of churches who don't have investments, and that's not strange either. But if you ever do come into some assets, whether it's $500 you want to be able to do a little better than the CDs, which don't pay much these days, or it's $500,000, you give us a call at the foundation. We have a number of different solutions that could fit your needs too. I want to thank you all for your time today. Our next session is going to be the second Tuesday of June, and I'll have Elder Paul Greer, who's one of our vice presidents from the foundation, with me. And Paul is gonna, we're gonna look at the church and where we are, really thinking about, you know, if we look at a slope of energy and growth and just where we might be in the church, might we be in a downturn? Might we be going back up? But how do we think about our ministry? And he'll share a number of different scenarios of what other churches have done. He'll share stories of churches who have thought outside the box and done new things for ministry and really claimed resurrection and done it well. And he'll even have a few situations where they thought they had a good idea in mind, but maybe it was hinged on one person. And then the church kind of fell apart from that because it was hinged on one person, right? But he'll have different stories to get you to think creatively, and there'll be more time next time. We'll have an hour and a half to really talk together as a group, do some more